The auction block stood like a judgment seat in the center of Dry Creek's main square, its weathered wood stained dark by years of desert sun and human misery. Sheriff Thomas Malden climbed onto a wooden crate beside it, his bulk casting a shadow over the 5 people chained to the iron posts, driven deep into the hardpan earth. "Gentlemen," Malden's voice boomed across the gathered crowd of ranchers, drifters, and opportunists who'd ridden in from across the territory. "Today we got prime stock for your consideration. The first to sell was a young Mexican man, strong-backed and silent. Bidding started at $30 and climbed quickly to $65 before a mine foreman claimed him with a satisfied grunt. Next came an older woman with calloused hands, a cook perhaps, or a seamstress. She went for $40 to a saloon owner from Tombstone. But it was the girl chained to the center post who drew the most attention. Lila Brennan stood with her chin raised despite the purple bruises that mottled her fair skin like storm clouds. Her dress, once a respectable blue calico, hung in tatters that barely preserved her modesty. Dark hair fell in tangled waves around a face that might have been beautiful if not for the split lip and the defiant fire burning in her green eyes. Now here's something special," Malden announced, his voice thick with mock appreciation. "Young, pretty enough when cleaned up, and with enough spirit to keep a man entertained." The bidding was enthusiastic but brief. At $80 it stalled. At $90 it stopped entirely. "Come now, gentlemen," Malden cajoled. "Surely someone wants this fine specimen," a voice called out from the back. "That's the one-bit Jake Morrison, ain't it?" Took off 3 fingers, another confirmed. "Like a rabid coyote, that one." The crowd began to murmur and disperse. Word had spread about the incident, how Lila had sunk her teeth into Jake Morrison's hand during a previous auction attempt and held on until she tasted bone. The resulting infection had nearly killed him, and the scars were visible whenever he lifted a drink to his lips. As the sun began its descent toward the jagged mountains, the last of the other captives were sold and led away. Only Lila remained forgotten and unwanted, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the iron post. The tremor lasted only a moment before she forced her fingers still. But someone watching closely might have wondered what memory had caused such an involuntary response. That someone was Jack Avery. The stranger had ridden into Dry Creek an hour before sunset, leading a pack horse and looking for nothing more than water and supplies. 35 years old, with the lean build of a man who'd lived hard and traveled far, Jack carried himself with the careful posture of someone favoring an old injury. His left leg bore the stiff gait of a limb that had been shattered and healed, crooked, a souvenir from Gettysburg that ached whenever storms approached. He'd meant to ride on after buying supplies. The auction was none of his business, and he'd learned long ago not to interfere in other people's troubles. But something about the girl's eyes had stopped him cold. They reminded him of Mary, not in color. Mary's had been brown as creek stones, but in the fierce determination that refused to break, even when breaking might have been a mercy. The same look his sister had worn during those final days in the burned-out farmhouse in Georgia when the fever was taking her. And she was fighting it with nothing but stubborn will. Jack approached the auction block as Malden counted his day's earnings. The sheriff looked up with mild irritation at the interruption. "Auction's over, stranger. Nothing left but damaged goods." "What about her?" Jack nodded toward Lila. Malden's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "That one, hell, you can have her for whatever's in your pocket. Ain't nobody fool enough to take her home." Jack reached into his vest and withdrew his last gold piece, a $20 eagle that had been his stake for California, his ticket to whatever future waited beyond the desert. It caught the dying light as he held it up. "This enough? More than she's worth," Malden replied, snatching the coin with greedy fingers. "But I ain't in the habit of turning down good money. Just remember no returns when she tries to gut you in your sleep." The sheriff tossed Jack a ring of keys and walked away, whistling tunelessly. His deputies followed, leaving Jack alone with his purchase. Lila watched him approach with the coiled tension of a mountain cat. When he knelt to unlock her shackles, she spoke her first words of the day. "I'll bite off whatever part of you touches me first." Her voice was hoarse from thirst and abuse, but the promise in it was absolute. Jack paused in his work with the key, meeting her eyes steadily. "I reckon you would," he said quietly. "I would too in your place." The shackles fell away with a dull clatter, but Lila didn't move. She studied Jack's weathered face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read men's intentions in the set of their shoulders, the speed of their breathing, the direction of their gaze. What she saw confused her. No hunger, no cruelty, just a bone-deep weariness that seemed to match her own. "Why?" she asked. Jack straightened slowly, his damaged leg protesting the movement. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, promising one of the violent storms that swept across the desert without warning. "Because somebody should," he said simply. It wasn't much of an answer, but something in his tone made her believe it was honest. Lila had developed a nose for honesty. It was rarer than gold in places like Dry Creek. "I got water." Jack offered, unhooking a canteen from his saddle. "And food. You look like you could use both." Lila's throat was raw with thirst, but accepting help meant accepting obligation. And she'd had enough of men's obligations to last several lifetimes. Still, her body made the choice for her. She took the canteen and drank deeply, water spilling down her chin and soaking into her ruined dress. "Easy," Jack warned gently. "Too much too fast will make you sick." She lowered the canteen and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, studying him with fresh wariness. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing you ain't willing to give." "Every man wants something." "Maybe so, but I ain't looking to collect today." The first fat raindrops began to fall as Jack gathered his horse's reins. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by the low rumble of approaching thunder. "Storm's coming," he observed. "We need shelter." Lila hesitated, torn between the devil she knew and the stranger who just bought her freedom. But the alternative was spending the night chained to a post in a thunderstorm, and even her stubborn pride had limits. "There's a stable behind Mackenzie's store," she said reluctantly. "Roof's mostly sound." They made their way through Dry Creek's dusty streets as the storm built overhead. The few people they encountered hurried indoors at the sight of them, as if escaped property carried some kind of contagion. Lila felt their stares like brands against her skin, but kept her head high. The stable was a skeleton of weathered boards and rusted nails, but it would keep the worst of the weather out. Jack's horse snorted nervously as thunder crashed overhead, shaking the building's frame. "Going to be a bad one," Jack muttered, unsaddling his mount with practiced efficiency. He was right. Within minutes, the sky opened like a burst dam, sending sheets of rain cascading from the stable's eaves. Lightning split the darkness in jagged silver scars, each flash illuminating their makeshift shelter in stark detail. Jack spread his bedroll in the driest corner and gestured for Lila to share it. She sat as far from him as the space allowed, accepting the jerky and hardtack he offered, but watching him with predatory alertness. "You talk educated," she said after they'd eaten in silence. "Seminary before the war." "What happened?" "Well, I learned too much about the world to believe in much beyond what I can see and touch." Lila nodded. She understood that kind of disillusionment. They settled down to wait out the storm, Jack banking their small fire, while Lila remained upright against the wall. Every few minutes, she would shift position slightly, and her hands would tremble for just a moment before she forced them still. Whatever memory haunted her, it was strong enough to break through even her iron self-control. "You should sleep," Jack said without opening his eyes. "Should I?" "I ain't going anywhere in this weather. Neither are you." "How do I know you won't?" "Because if I was going to hurt you, I'd have done it already." His voice carried quiet conviction. "And because I've seen what happens to girls who got no one to protect them." Something in his tone made Lila look at him more closely. In the firelight, his face was lined with old grief, aged beyond his years by memories that wouldn't rest. "Your sister," she guessed. Jack's eyes opened, meeting hers across the small space. "How'd you know?" Same look my father got when he talked about my mother. Like something precious got broken and couldn't be fixed. Mary was her name. 16 years old when the deserters found our farm. I was off playing soldier, thought I was saving the world. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Came home to find her dying, and all I could do was hold her hand while she apologized for not being strong enough to fight them off. Lila felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of suspicion she'd carried since her father's death. This man understood loss. He knew what it meant to arrive too late to save the people who mattered. I'm sorry, she said and meant it. So am I. Exhaustion finally claimed her in the small hours before dawn, her body's need overriding her mind's caution. She woke to the sound of splintering wood and the stench of cheap whiskey. Pete Garrison stood in what remained of the doorway after he'd kicked it in. One of Malden's regular hands, Pete was mean when sober and vicious when drunk. Right now, he was very drunk. Well, he slurred, eyes fixing on Lila with predatory hunger. Looks like somebody left me a present. Jack was already moving, rising from sleep to full alertness, with the fluid motion of a man who'd learned to wake ready for trouble. But Pete had position and momentum on his side. The whiskey bottle caught Jack across the temple with enough force to stagger him backward into the stable wall. Stars exploded behind his eyes, and he felt warm blood trickling down his cheek. "Ya should have minded your own business, stranger." Pete growled, advancing on Lila with drunken determination. "Now you get to watch what happens to whores who think they're too good for honest work." Lila scrambled backward, looking for anything she could use as a weapon. Her fingers closed around a rusted horseshoe just as Pete lunged for her. She never got the chance to use it. Jack hit Pete from behind, like a falling tree, driving the bigger man face first into the stable floor. Pete rolled with surprising agility for someone so drunk, swinging wildly with fists like ham hocks. The fight that followed was brief but vicious. Pete was bigger and stronger, but Jack had learned fighting in army camps and border towns where pretty techniques mattered less than staying alive. When Pete tried to grapple, Jack drove his knee into the man's solar plexus. When Pete swung for his head, Jack ducked and landed a solid punch to his opponent's kidney. But Pete's desperation made him dangerous. He managed to land a solid blow to Jack's already injured ribs, the impact driving the air from his lungs and sending him to his knees. Pete drew back his foot for a killing kick and found Lila's horseshoe connecting with his skull with a wet thud. Pete dropped like a sack of grain blood pooling beneath his head. For a moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing and the drip of rain from the stable's eaves. "Is he dead?" Lila asked, her voice surprisingly steady. Jack knelt beside Pete's still form and checked for a pulse. "No, but he'll have a powerful headache when he wakes up. We need to be long gone by then." They gathered their few possessions quickly, Jack moving stiffly as his injured ribs protested every motion. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind the crystal-clear air that followed desert rains. "Which way?" Jack asked as he helped Lila onto his horse. She pointed toward the red mesa country that stretched endlessly to the north. "There's canyons up there. Places where a person can disappear if they know the way. And you know the way. My father taught me." Her voice caught slightly on the words, and her hands trembled before she clenched them into fists. Before what? But Lila had already turned away, scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. Whatever she'd been about to say would have to wait. They rode out of Dry Creek as the sun climbed toward its throne, leaving behind the only home Lila had ever known. Behind them, smoke was beginning to rise from various chimneys as the town came to life. Soon, Pete would wake up with a cracked skull and a story to tell his boss, and Sheriff Thomas Malden would not be pleased. The Badlands opened before them like a vast, broken promise. Red sandstone mesas jutted from the desert floor like the bones of sleeping giants, and the air already shimmered with heat waves despite the early hour. Jack's horse picked its way carefully along game trails that wound between scattered boulders and stands of prickly pear cactus. Lila rode behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist in a grip that was part necessity, part lingering mistrust. Every few minutes, she would twist to scan their back trail, watching for the dust cloud that would announce pursuit. They rode in companionable silence for the first hour, both lost in their own thoughts. But as the sun climbed higher and the heat grew more oppressive, Lila began to fidget behind him. Her hands would tremble against his back, then tremble again. "You want to tell me what's got you spooked?" Jack asked finally. "Nothing's got me spooked. Your hands are shaking like you got palsy. That ain't nothing." Lila was quiet for so long that Jack thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the horse's hoofbeats. "It's just, when Pete grabbed for me back there for a minute, I thought I was back in the barn." "What barn?" Another long silence. Then, "The one where Billy Malden tried to—" She didn't finish the sentence. Jack's jaw tightened. Sheriff Malden had a son Jack remembered seeing the boy around town, a swaggering youth in his early 20s with his father's cruel eyes and his mother's weak chin. "When was this?" 3 months after my father died. Billy came to the ranch drunk as usual. Said he'd protect me from his father's auctions if I was grateful." The pieces were starting to fit together in Jack's mind, forming a picture he didn't like. "What happened?" I said no, he didn't like that answer. Jack waited, sensing there was more to the story. But before Lila could continue, the crack of a rifle shot echoed across the canyon, and he felt a bullet part the air, inches from his ear. "Down!" he shouted, spurring the horse toward the shelter of a massive boulder. More shots followed, the reports echoing off canyon walls like thunder. Jack counted muzzle flashes as they dismounted behind cover, at least 5 riders, maybe more, approaching from the south with obvious hostile intent. "How many?" he asked, checking his rifle. Lila peered around the boulder's edge. 6. Malden's leading them. "Can you shoot?" "Some. My father taught me." Jack handed her his spare Colt, a .44 caliber revolver that had served him well during the war. "Make every shot count. We can't afford to waste ammunition." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Soon they could hear Malden's voice booming across the canyon. "Hey, Brennan, you come out now and I'll make it quick. But if you make me come after you, I'll take my time." Lila's finger tightened on the trigger. "He killed my father," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "I figured as much. I want him dead. Get in line." The gunfight that followed was brief but intense. Jack's first shot took one of Malden's men clean out of his saddle, the rider tumbling to the canyon floor in a cloud of dust. The return fire was immediate, and accurate chips of stone flew from their boulder as bullets sparked off the rock face. But Malden's men had made a tactical error. They'd approached through the narrow canyon mouth, which limited their ability to flank the boulder. It gave Jack and Lila a fighting chance, at least for the moment. "We need to move," Jack said during a brief lull in the shooting. "They'll work around behind us eventually. There's a gap in the canyon wall about 50 yards north." Lila replied, reloading her revolver with steady hands. "Leads to another canyon system." "Can you make it? Can you?" It was a fair question. Jack's ribs ached from Pete's punch, and his old leg wound was already beginning to stiffen from the morning's exertions. But they didn't have much choice. "When I give covering fire, you run," Jack instructed. "Don't look back, don't hesitate. Just run." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Jack was planning to buy her escape with his life, to finally balance the scales that had been weighted against him since Mary's death. Lila had other ideas. When Jack broke cover to lay down suppressing fire, she didn't run for the gap. Instead, she flanked left, using the canyon's natural cover to work her way around behind Malden's position. It was a desperate gambit that required more luck than skill, but desperation had always been her specialty. Her first shot took one of Malden's men in the shoulder, spinning him around like a child's top. Her second went wide, but it served its purpose, drawing attention away from Jack and creating the confusion he needed to advance. The firefight stretched on under the merciless desert sun. In the close confines of the canyon, every shot echoed like thunder, and the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic taste of fear. When the smoke finally cleared, 3 of Malden's men were down, 1 was wounded, and the sheriff himself had taken a bullet in his left arm. But Jack was hurt too, clutching his side, where a ricocheting bullet had found its mark. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark against his white shirt. "How bad?" Lila asked, appearing at his side. "Bad enough." Jack struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the canyon wall. "We need to move before they regroup." They helped each other toward the gap Lila had spotted, moving slowly through the maze of stone passages that honeycombed the mesa. Behind them, they could hear Malden's voice raised in fury, promising terrible retribution for his fallen men. The gap led to another canyon, then another, each one taking them deeper into the Badlands, and further from any hope of rescue. It was country that could hide an army, but it could also kill the unwary through exposure, dehydration, or simple bad luck. They found shelter in a shallow cave as the sun reached its brutal zenith. Jack's wound had stopped bleeding, but infection was already setting in. His skin felt hot to the touch, and his eyes held the glassy sheen of approaching fever. "You should go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where?" "Anywhere. Mexico, California, somewhere Malden can't follow." Lila turned from her vigil at the cave mouth. "I'm not leaving." "Don't be foolish. You have a chance." "I said I'm not leaving." Jack closed his eyes, conserving his strength. Outside, the wind moaned through the canyon, like the voices of the damned. In that mournful sound, Lila heard echoes of her father's voice, her mother's laughter, all the ghosts of the life Malden had stolen from her. "There's something you need to know," she said suddenly, "about why Malden really wants me dead." Jack opened his eyes, focusing on her with effort. "It's not just because I saw what happened to my father." Lila continued, her voice growing stronger. "It's because of what I did to Billy." She took a deep breath, steadying herself for the confession that would either damn her or set her free. "That day in the barn, Billy didn't just try to force himself on me. He said things. Terrible things about what he was going to do, how I should be grateful for the attention. When I tried to fight him off, he hit me. Called me names that would make a saloon girl blush." Jack's expression remained neutral, but she could see the tension in his jaw. There was a broken whiskey bottle on the ground Billy had been drinking like always. "When he came at me again, tearing at my dress, I grabbed it and—" She paused, staring at her small hands. "I stuck it right in his neck. Deep. Blood went everywhere, and he fell down, making this awful sound like a broken bellows." "Self-defense," Jack said quietly. "Maybe the law would see it that way. Maybe not." But Billy Malden died looking up at me with surprise in his eyes, like he couldn't believe a girl could fight back. The admission hung between them like smoke. Jack studied Lila's face in the dim light of the cave, seeing not the broken victim he'd rescued from the auction block, but a young woman who'd been pushed beyond her limits and had pushed back with deadly force. That's when Malden decided regular punishment wasn't enough. Lila went on. "He wanted me to suffer first to know what it felt like to be unwanted and abandoned. Then he was going to have me killed slowly, publicly, as an example." "But you're not sorry?" "No. I'm not sorry Billy Malden is dead. I'm only sorry I couldn't save my father the same way." Jack nodded slowly. He understood the weight of taking a life, even in defense. He also understood the alternative and the price of failing to act when action was required. "Get some rest," he told her. "Tomorrow we figure out how to end this." But Lila was already making plans of her own. As Jack's fever climbed and his breathing grew labored, she made a decision that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew her. She was done running. Jack's fever broke sometime during the night, but he woke to find Lila gone. His horse was still there along with most of their supplies, but the woman he'd bought for a gold coin had vanished like smoke on the wind. For a moment, he felt a familiar stab of loss. Another person he'd failed to protect, another life he'd arrived too late to save. Then he noticed that his spare revolver was missing, along with most of their ammunition. Lila hadn't run away. She'd gone hunting. The abandoned mining camp of Copper Falls had been dead for a decade. Another victim of played-out veins and cheaper ore found elsewhere. What remained was a collection of weathered buildings arranged around a central plaza, all connected by sagging boardwalks that creaked ominously in the desert wind. It was the perfect place for desperate people to make their final stands. Malden's reduced posse had made camp in the ruins of the old assay office, using its thick stone walls for protection, while they planned their next move. 4 men rode with the sheriff. Now the others had been left behind in yesterday's canyon fight, feeding the vultures that circled endlessly overhead. Lila approached from the east, using the rising sun to mask her approach against the distant mountains. She'd learned stealth from her father during their hunting trips, back when the world made sense and good men lived to see their daughters grow up. The first guard died without making a sound, her knife sliding between his ribs as he dozed at his post. She lowered his body gently, then took his rifle and cartridge belt. The weapon was a Winchester repeater, well maintained and fully loaded. The second guard was more alert, but not alert enough. He managed half a shout before her bullet took him in the chest, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. "She's here," someone screamed from inside the assay office. "Where?" "I don't know, find her." Lila smiled grimly and put another bullet through the office window, shattering glass, and sending the men inside diving for cover. The return fire was immediate, but poorly aimed muzzle flashes in the dim interior wild shots that went high and wide. She changed position, circling the camp like a hunting wolf. These men were dangerous in groups, but spread them out, make them jump at shadows, and they became just frightened men with guns. The third man tried to flank her and walked into a rifle bullet that dropped him in his tracks. The fourth panicked and ran for the horses, only to discover that Lila had cut the picket line during her initial approach. "Malden." She called out, her voice carrying across the ruined camp. "You wanted me dead. Come and try." The sheriff's answering roar was wordless with rage. He burst from the assay office with his remaining deputy, both men firing wildly in her direction. Bullets whined off stone and sent up puffs of dust, but Lila was already moving to a new position. The cat-and-mouse game continued as the sun climbed higher, brutal heat adding to the stress of combat. Lila used every trick her father had taught her, every lesson learned from a childhood spent in hostile country. She was faster, smarter, and more motivated than her opponents, but she was also running low on ammunition, and exhaustion was beginning to tell. The sleepless night, the stress of combat, the desert heat, they all combined to slow her reflexes and cloud her judgment. That's when Malden's deputy got lucky. The bullet caught her in the left shoulder, spinning her around and sending her rifle flying. She rolled behind a water trough as more shots chewed splinters from the wood above her head, hot fragments raining down on her back. Pain lanced through her shoulder like liquid fire, and she could feel warm blood soaking into her shirt. The wound wasn't fatal, but it had cost her the use of her left arm. She drew Jack's revolver with her good hand, checking the cylinder. 4 shots left. It would have to be enough. "Got the bitch," the deputy yelled triumphantly. "About damn time," Malden replied, emerging from cover with predatory satisfaction. "Bring her out here. I want to finish this personal." Lila took a deep breath, centering herself the way her father had taught her before difficult shots. Pain was just another distraction, he'd always said. Master the distraction, master the shot. She stood up from behind the trough revolver, steady in her right hand, despite the fire in her left shoulder. At 20 paces, she and Malden's remaining men faced each other across the dusty plaza of Copper Falls. "You killed my boy," Malden said, his voice thick with grief and rage. "Your boy was a rapist and a coward," Lila replied steadily. "He was my son. He was garbage, just like his father." The deputy moved first, swinging his rifle toward her with practiced speed. But Lila had been expecting it. Her first shot took him center mass, the .44 slug, spinning him around like a dancer before he collapsed in the dust. Malden was faster than she'd expected for a man his size. His shot came close enough to burn the fabric of her sleeve, but close wasn't good enough in gunfights. Her second bullet caught him in the chest, staggering him backward. But the sheriff was tough as old leather. He kept his feet, kept his gun up, kept firing. His next shot went wide. Lila's third bullet found its mark, and Thomas Malden finally went down. He lay in the dust of Copper Falls, staring up at the merciless sky with eyes that no longer saw anything. The man who had terrorized an entire territory with his corruption and cruelty had been brought low by a 20-year-old girl with 4 bullets and the will to use them. Lila stood over his body, swaying slightly from blood loss and exhaustion. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the end of something, not just Malden's reign of terror, but her own long journey through darkness toward something like peace. The ride back to Jack took most of the day. Her shoulder wound had clotted, but the loss of blood left her weak and dizzy. She clung to the saddle horn with her good hand and trusted Jack's horse to find its way. She found him sitting at the cave mouth, his fever finally broken, and his color much improved. When he saw her approaching, bloodied, swaying in the saddle but very much alive, relief flooded his weathered features. "Malden?" he asked as she slid from the horse into his waiting arms. "Dead, along with his men." "Good." Jack helped her into the cave and tended her wound with strips torn from his spare shirt. The bullet had passed clean through missing bone and major blood vessels. She would heal given time and proper care. "What now?" she asked as he finished bandaging her shoulder. "Now we disappear. California, maybe, or Oregon. Somewhere we can start fresh." Jack met her eyes, and in them she saw the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that lived in her own heart. They were both damaged people, both carrying scars that would never fully fade. But perhaps that was what they needed, someone who understood the weight of the past, who could help carry burdens too heavy for one person alone. "If you want," he said quietly. Lila thought about it for exactly 3 heartbeats before nodding. "I want." 3 weeks later, news of Sheriff Malden's death reached the territorial capital. An investigation was launched, but it was perfunctory at best. Too many important people had profited from Malden's unofficial auctions to want the truth examined too closely. But the auction stopped. The network of corruption that had flourished under Malden's protection withered without his protection. Gradually, decent people began moving back into Dry Creek's abandoned buildings. It would never be a prosperous town, but it might yet become an honest one. By then, Jack and Lila were already gone, riding west toward California, and whatever future awaited them beyond the mountains. They traveled as husband and wife, a convenient fiction that became truth somewhere along the trail, sealed with vows spoken under starlight, and witnessed only by coyotes and desert wind. They settled in a small town called Haven's Rest, where questions about the past were considered impolite and a person's worth was measured by their actions rather than their history. Jack found work at the local livery stable, his skill with horses earning quick respect. Lila opened a small school, her education surprising many but pleasing parents who wanted better futures for their children. On Sundays, they walked together to the white church at the end of Main Street. Jack had found his way back to faith, not the certainty he'd lost in the war, but a quieter hope that made life's burdens easier to bear. Lila was still learning to trust in things unseen, but she was patient with the process. Sometimes late at night, when desert wind rattled their windows, they would lie awake and remember. The auction yard at Dry Creek, the cave in the Badlands, the moment when 2 broken people had found strength in each other that neither possessed alone. They never spoke of those memories aloud. There was no need. They had lived through them together, survived them together, and now they were building something new from the ashes of what had been lost. On their first Christmas in Haven's Rest, Jack gave Lila a simple gold band made by the town's jeweler. It wasn't fancy, just honest work by honest hands paid for with honest money. Lila gave him a photograph taken by the traveling portraitist who visited each fall. It showed her sitting by their front window, smiling genuinely for what might have been the first time in years. On the back, in her careful script, she'd written, "For the man who bought my freedom with his last gold coin." But Jack knew better. Lila had bought her own freedom in the ruins of Copper Falls, paid for it with blood and courage, and the kind of determination that moves mountains. He'd just been fortunate enough to witness her transformation from victim to survivor to something far stronger. The people of Haven's Rest never learned the full truth about their schoolteacher and the man she'd married. They knew only that the Averys were good neighbors and the kind of people who made a community stronger by their presence, which was exactly as it should be. Some stories were meant to be legends growing larger with each telling. Others were meant to be lived quietly, their power measured not in fame, but in the simple act of choosing hope over despair, love over loneliness. Jack and Lila chose the quieter path. They built their happiness one ordinary day at a time, finding in each other the family they'd lost and the future they'd feared might never come. And if sometimes they stood at their window on moonless nights, watching the distant mountains for riders who would never come, that was a secret they kept between themselves and the patient stars.